What if the oldest stories weren't meant to explain the world, but to remember when it changed forever? What if the gods described in clay weren't metaphors for natural forces, but memories of the exact moment when everything humanity knew about itself was rewritten? In the dust-choked ruins of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once carved life from desert, archaeologists uncovered something that shouldn't exist in the timeline we've constructed. Texts that speak of a before. A time when the people of Sumer lived differently, worshipped differently, organized their world according to patterns that vanished when beings called the Anunnaki entered their story. Not gradually, not through cultural evolution, but suddenly, as if history itself bent under the weight of their arrival. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between divine intervention and civilizational transformation. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. The tablets are explicit about this. There was life in Sumer before the Anunnaki, simpler perhaps, quieter. And then came the change that echoes through every text, every king list, every cosmology scratched into clay. Tonight we journey to that threshold, to the moment when humanity stopped being one thing and became another. Let the ancient voices guide you towards sleep, before there were temples tall enough to scrape the heavens, before kings claimed divine ancestry, before the very concept of writing existed to capture what the priests were saying. There were villages, small settlements of reed houses and mud brick scattered along waterways that no longer exist, inhabited by people whose names are lost but whose pottery survived. The Ubaid period, stretching from approximately 5,500 to 4,000 BCE, represents Mesopotamia before the mythology we recognize, before the word "zero" was ever pressed into clay. Imagine standing on the edge of one of these settlements as the sun rises over the marshlands. The air is thick with moisture, the smell of wet earth and river plants. Houses built from bundled reeds and mud plaster cluster together. Their walls painted with simple geometric patterns in ochre and black. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Children play near the water's edge while their parents check fishing nets stretched between posts driven into the riverbed. This is humanity before the grand narrative, before the gods had organized themselves into councils and hierarchies, before anyone had conceived of divine kingship or cosmic law. The people of the Ubaid period were farmers, but not the intensive agriculturalists the Sumerians would later become. They cultivated barley and wheat in small plots fertilized by seasonal floods. They kept sheep and goats, caught fish in the abundant marshes, gathered wild plants from the riverbanks. Their pottery is their most enduring legacy, wheel-made vessels decorated with flowing patterns that suggest water, plants, and abstract forms that might be proto-religious symbols or might simply be beautiful. Each pot is unique, made by individual hands, fired in small kilns, used until it broke and was discarded in middens that would later become treasure troves for archaeologists trying to understand how these people lived. What the Ubaid settlements lack is grandiosity. There are no palaces, no massive public works, no monumental architecture declaring the presence of divine beings on earth. The buildings are human-scaled, practical, designed for living, rather than for impressing the gods or demonstrating power over neighbours. The dead were buried beneath the floors of houses wrapped in reed matting, accompanied by simple grave goods, pottery vessels and shell ornaments. No royal tombs, no elaborate afterlife provisions, Nothing suggesting these people believed the dead required eternal sustenance, or that some individuals deserved more in death than others. Trade networks existed, but on a modest scale. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Persian Gulf, turquoise from Iran, materials that had to be carried hundreds of miles, appear in Ubaid sites, evidence of exchange and contact with distant regions. But these were supplementary goods, luxuries perhaps, not the massive trade operations that would later characterize Sumerian city-states. The economy was local, self-sufficient, based on what the land and water could provide. There was no need yet for the complex administrative systems that would emerge millennia later. No priests controlling redistribution of surplus, no temples functioning as economic powerhouses, and most significantly, there was no writing. No way to record names, events, transactions, myths, or prayers. Whatever these people believed about the world, about the forces that controlled rain and flood and harvest, about what happened after death, vanished with them into the silence that precedes written history. If they had gods, we don't know what they called them. If they had origin stories, we can't read them. If they wondered where civilization came from, their answers dissolved into the air like smoke from their cooking fires. The difficulty with studying pre-literate Mesopotamia is the silence. No tablets survive from 5500 BCE because writing wouldn't be invented for another 1500 years. What we know of life before the Anunnaki entered Sumerian consciousness comes entirely from what people left behind. Broken pottery, abandoned tools, the post holes where houses once stood, the bones of animals they domesticated and consumed. British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating at in the 1920s, found layers beneath layers. Settlements older than any text could describe, reaching back into a time when the people of southern Mesopotamia had not yet learned to speak their gods' names aloud. Woolley was searching for Sumerian civilization, for the spectacular finds that would capture public imagination and justify his expedition's expense. What he found instead, beneath the royal cemetery with its golden treasures and sacrificial burials, were humbler remains. Ubaid pottery, fragments of walls, the detritus of ordinary life lived thousands of years before kings claimed descent from heaven. At first, these deeper layers seemed like an inconvenience, obstacles blocking access to the more glamorous upper strata. But gradually, Woolley and his colleagues recognized what they were seeing, evidence that Mesopotamian civilization had roots extending far deeper than anyone had imagined, back into a time when people lived without the social complexity, the political hierarchy, the religious certainty that would later define Sumer. Other excavations across southern Iraq confirmed the pattern. Everywhere archaeologists dug deep enough. They found Ubaid remains beneath Sumerian cities. At Eridu, beneath Enki's temple, Ubaid houses and pottery. At Uruk, beneath the massive temple complexes dedicated to Inanna and An, Ubaid occupation layers. At Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, home to Enlil's supremacy, earlier settlements that predated the city's sacred status by millennia. The message was clear. Before the gods, there were people. Before theology organized the cosmos, there were villages organized around the practical necessities of survival. What archaeology reveals about this pre-Anunnaki period is a culture comfortable with ambiguity, with local variation, with the organic development of community without divine blueprint. Each Ubaid settlement had its own character, its own pottery styles, its own architectural preferences. There was no standardization, no centralized authority imposing uniformity, No evidence that these communities saw themselves as part of a larger civilizational project. They were simply people living, adapting to the environment, developing technologies that worked, passing knowledge from generation to generation through demonstration and memory rather than written instruction. The archaeological method itself becomes poetic when dealing with such ancient silence. Researchers sift through dirt, screening for fragments of pottery smaller than fingernails, bones that might reveal what animals were eaten, seeds that show what plants were cultivated. Each excavation is an act of patience, carefully peeling back layers of earth like pages in a book written in mud and broken things. The Ubaid period requires this patience because it refuses to declare itself loudly. It simply exists in the strata, waiting for those willing to excavate slowly enough, carefully enough, to hear what the silence is saying about a time before gods demanded to be heard. Something changed around 4500 BCE. The archaeological record shows it clearly. Buildings that aren't houses begin appearing, structures too large for single families, too deliberately oriented to cardinal directions to be accidental, containing artifacts that suggest ritual purpose. These proto-temples from the late Ubaid period represent humanity's first architectural conversation with the divine, but they predate the complex Sumerian Pantheon by a millennium. Whoever the people worshipped in these early temples, the elaborate mythology of the Anunnaki had not yet crystallized into the form we recognize from later texts. The earliest of these temples are modest by later standards. A single room, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with walls slightly thicker than domestic architecture, built on a low platform that elevates it above the surrounding settlement. Inside, an altar or offering table, sometimes a hearth for burning offerings, niches in the walls where cult objects might have been placed. The orientation is deliberate, aligned to cardinal directions with accuracy that suggests astronomical observation, or at least careful attention to the sun's movements. These buildings were constructed with intention, with meaning, with the understanding that some activities required spaces separate from daily domestic life. At Eridu, archaeologists found the earliest iteration of what would become Enki's temple, a simple shrine from the late Ubaid period, approximately 4800 BCE. The building contained fish bones, suggesting offerings of fish, appropriate given Eridu's position near marshlands and the later association of Enki with fresh water and aquatic abundance. But this was not yet Enki's temple in any sense the later Sumerians would recognize. It was simply a sacred space, a place where the community gathered to acknowledge forces beyond human control, to offer gratitude for abundance or supplication for mercy, to perform rituals whose specific nature we can only infer from the material traces they left behind. What's remarkable is the commitment these early temple builders displayed. These weren't afterthoughts, casual shrines thrown together with whatever materials were handy. The temples required coordinated labor, planning, resources diverted from immediate survival needs to construct buildings serving purely ritual purposes. Someone in these communities had to convince enough people that dedicating time and materials to building houses for the divine, or for whatever they understood as divine, was worthwhile. This suggests a priesthood, or at least individuals recognized as having special knowledge of or connection to the sacred, people whose role in the community was specifically religious rather than directly productive. And here's where the mystery deepens. These early temples were rebuilt, often on the exact same spot following the same orientation, maintaining continuity of sacred space over generations. The pattern suggests not just casual belief, but established tradition, protocols for how to approach the divine, expectations about what the gods or spirits or forces required from humans. Yet we have no texts explaining any of this. No prayers, no liturgies, no theological treatises. The buildings speak. But they speak in the silent language of architecture and orientation, in the mute testimony of offering tables and altar platforms. By 4200 BCE, these proto-temples were becoming more elaborate. Multiple rooms, more sophisticated decoration, larger platforms elevating them further above profane ground. The trajectory is clear, from simple shrines to complex ritual centers, from community gathering places to buildings that dominated settlements architecturally and presumably socially. The gods were being given larger houses, more impressive residences, as if the divine presence required increasingly grand accommodation to remain interested in human affairs. But whose gods were these? The later Sumerian pantheon was highly specific. Each deity had a name, a personality, a domain of influence, relationships with other gods, temples in particular cities, rituals performed at specific times according to calendrical precision. Did the Ubaid temple builders worship the same deities? Was the shrine at Eridu already dedicated to the god who would later be called Enki, even though that name wouldn't be written down for another 1,000 years? Or were these temples housing vaguer divinities, unnamed forces of water and fertility and harvest, entities that would only later be organized into the structured pantheon the texts describe? Archaeology cannot answer this. We can trace the physical continuity, temple built atop temple on the same sacred ground, but the theological continuity remains invisible. It's possible, even likely, that the Anunnaki mythology as we know it from texts evolved from earlier, simpler religious conceptions, that the gods described in Sumerian literature were refined and elaborated versions of deities or spirits, worshipped in cruder form by the Ubaid peoples. But it's also possible there was a break, a moment when new ideas replaced old ones, when a new understanding of the divine superseded whatever had come before. The temples keep their secrets, offering architectural evidence of devotion, but withholding the beliefs that motivated that devotion. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first city ever created, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the spot where the god Enki established his temple before any other divine being claimed territory on earth. But archaeology tells a different story. The Ubaid settlement at Tel Abu Shahrain, ancient Eridu, dates back to 5400 BCE, making it one of Mesopotamia's oldest continuously inhabited sites. For thousands of years, people lived there without the mythology that would later claim the city had been chosen by gods. The temple to Enki that excavators found was rebuilt 17 times on the same spot, each iteration larger, more elaborate, more confident in its theology. Walk through the excavated levels of Eridu in your mind. As descending through layers of time, at the top, in the relatively recent strata from the early dynastic period around 2800 BCE, the temple is massive, a complex of rooms and courtyards built on a high platform, walls decorated with elaborate mosaics, drains to carry away the water from ritual purifications, storage rooms for offerings, living quarters for priests. This is Enki's house in its full glory. The god of wisdom and fresh water residing in architectural splendor appropriate to his cosmic significance. Descend deeper, and the temple becomes simpler, smaller, but still recognizably a temple, still oriented the same direction, still occupying the same sacred ground. Keep descending through the layers, through the Uruk period temples with their decorated facades and niches for cult statues, through the late Ubaid temples with their multiple rooms and offering tables, down to the earliest shrine, Temple Wa in the archaeological designation, a simple rectangle from 4800 BCE, walls of mud brick, a single room barely large enough for a dozen people, containing an offering table and fish bones and little else. But it's there, on the same spot where 17 centuries later a massive temple complex would rise, as if the location itself possessed significance that transcended any particular architectural expression. The continuity is extraordinary. 17 building phases, each following the destruction or collapse of the previous iteration, each choosing to rebuild on precisely the same spot rather than selecting new ground. This wasn't accident or convenience. This was deliberate preservation of sacred space, a commitment spanning millennia, carried through by communities who may have differed in language, in political organization, in economic complexity, but agreed on one thing: this place mattered. This ground was where the divine touched earth, where offerings should be made, where humans could communicate with forces beyond human comprehension. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, Iraqi and British archaeologists who excavated Eridu in the 1940s and early 50s, found themselves tracing this architectural timeline in reverse, peeling away later magnificence to reveal earlier simplicity, discovering that beneath the city claimed by mythology as the first human settlement was something even older, humbler, a village that predated its own origin story. The paradox was delicious. Eridu really was one of the earlier settled sites in Mesopotamia, but it became first only in retrospect, only after later generations constructed a mythology that required a first city, a beginning point for civilization, a place where the cosmic order was established before spreading to other locations. What did the earliest inhabitants of Eridu believe about their settlement? Did they sense something special about the location, something that drew them to build not just houses but also that first simple temple? Or did the significance emerge gradually, the repeated rebuilding of the shrine creating sacredness through accumulated ritual, each generation adding their reverence to the layers beneath? The site sits near where freshwater springs emerge from the ground, a phenomenon that would later be mythologized as Enki's domain, the Abzu, the cosmic underground freshwater ocean. Perhaps those springs were always considered sacred, and the temples were built to honor the mystery of water emerging from earth in an otherwise arid landscape. By 3500 BCE, Eridu was no longer the dominant settlement in the region. That role had transferred to Uruk, 20 miles to the north, where different dynamics were creating the conditions for something unprecedented in human history. But Eridu retained its sacred status, its reputation as the oldest place, the first city, the location where civilization began. The mythology preserved this memory even as Eridu's political and economic significance faded. The texts from later periods still called Eridu the first city, still described how kingship descended there from heaven, still honoured Enki's temple as the primordial sacred space from which all other temples derived their legitimacy. The archaeological reality of humble Ubaid origins had been transformed through millennia into mythological primacy that made Eridu eternal first. Chosen by gods before gods even had the elaborate characteristics later texts attributed to them. Around 3400 BCE, something happened in Mesopotamia that archaeologists still struggle to explain. The city of Uruk, already substantial, suddenly exploded in size and complexity. Population surged. Monumental architecture appeared. Craft specialization intensified. Trade networks extended hundreds of miles, and most significantly within just a few generations. Writing emerged from what had been purely pictographic accounting into a system capable of recording language, mythology, and the names of gods. This is the moment when the Anunnaki enter the written record, not as newcomers to Sumerian thought, but as if they had always been there, already organized into hierarchies, already assigned domains of power, already intimately involved in human affairs. The transformation is visible in every aspect of the archaeological record. Before 3400 BCE, Uruk was a settlement, significant perhaps, but not fundamentally different from other communities scattered across the alluvial plain. By 3100 BCE, it was something else entirely, a city covering nearly 600 acres, home to perhaps 50,000 people, surrounded by smaller settlements bound to it through economic and political ties, dominated by temple complexes whose scale dwarfed anything previously built in human history. The White Temple, perched atop a massive platform 40 feet high, its walls made brilliant by white gypsum plaster, could be seen from miles away. A statement of human capacity to build skyward, to create artificial mountains in a flat landscape, to elevate sacred space literally and symbolically above the mundane world. This was the Uruk period, named for the city where the transformation was most dramatic, though similar changes occurred at other sites across southern Mesopotamia. It represents one of history's critical thresholds, the moment when village life became urban life, when face-to-face community organization gave way to institutional hierarchy, when everyone knowing everyone else became impossible, and cities required new mechanisms of control, coordination, and identity. And it happened fast, faster than gradual evolution should allow, fast enough that some scholars still debate whether we're seeing normal development compressed by favorable conditions, or something more unusual, some catalyst that accelerated changes that should have taken centuries into a transformation spanning mere generations. Writing appears in this context, initially as pure accounting. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3300 BCE, are economic documents, records of grain distributed, beer brewed, animals counted. The symbols are pictographic, direct representations of what they describe, a sheep head for sheep, a grain stalk for barley. But even these early tablets reveal a society organized around temples, with specialized workers receiving rations, with administrators tracking resources on behalf of institutions rather than individuals. Someone was managing Uruk's economy with precision that required documentation, creating permanent records of transactions that previously would have been remembered, if recorded at all. Within 2 centuries, the pictographic symbols became more abstract, more capable of representing sounds rather than just objects, evolving into the cuneiform script that would dominate Mesopotamian writing for 3,000 years. And with that capability came the first literature, the first recorded names of gods, the first glimpses of the mythology that explained how the world worked. The Anunnaki appear in these early texts as established entities, well known to the reader, requiring no introduction or explanation. There's no sense that these are new gods or new ideas. The texts treat the Anunnaki's existence and their relationship with humanity as obvious, as common knowledge that merely needed to be written down rather than discovered or invented. This creates a peculiar chronological problem. The mythology described in the earliest texts is already complex, already systematized, already featuring elaborate theological relationships between deities with specific domains and specific temples and specific rituals. Such sophistication doesn't emerge overnight. It requires generations of priestly speculation, debate, refinement, the slow accretion of tradition that becomes orthodoxy. But we have no record of that development, no preliminary stages, no simpler versions from which the complex final form evolved. The Anunnaki are simply there, complete, as if they had always existed in precisely the form the texts describe, waiting only for writing to invent itself so their existence could be properly documented. What bothers scholars about the Uruk period is the speed. Cities don't usually appear fully formed. Writing systems typically evolve gradually over centuries. Complex religious hierarchies usually develop through generations of theological refinement. But in Uruk, between 3400 and 3100 BCE, all of this happened simultaneously, as if someone had activated a switch, and Mesopotamian civilization jumped several stages forward in the blink of an archaeological eye. The texts from this period, when they begin describing the Anunnaki, speak of them not as recent arrivals, but as eternal presences who had always guided human destiny, creating a strange contradiction between what archaeology shows and what mythology claims. Consider what normally happens when societies increase in complexity. Population growth is gradual, responding to food surplus that accumulates over generations. Craft specialization emerges slowly as some individuals discover they can trade specialized skills for food. Writing develops through stages, from simple counting tokens to pictographs to phonetic systems, a process typically requiring centuries of experimentation. Religious beliefs elaborate over time as priests debate cosmology and ritual, building theological systems through accumulated tradition. None of these transformations happens overnight. They're evolutionary, incremental, leaving archaeological traces of each developmental stage. But Uruk breaks this pattern. Between 3400 and 3100 BCE, a span of just 300 years, the archaeological record shows transformations that should have required a millennium. The city's population didn't grow steadily but exploded, expanding from perhaps 5,000 inhabitants to 50,000 in what amounts to a few human generations. The temple complexes didn't evolve from modest shrines, but appeared as massive architectural statements, requiring organizational capacity and labor mobilization on scales that shouldn't have been possible without centuries of administrative development. Writing didn't emerge through slow refinement, but appeared suddenly, moving from non-existence to functional bureaucratic documentation in less than a century, then to literary capability within 2 centuries more. Hans Nissen, the German archaeologist who spent decades analyzing Uruk period materials, described the phenomenon as revolutionary rather than evolutionary, a fundamental break with previous patterns of development. His excavations at Uruk in the 1960s and 70s revealed the sheer scale of what was built during this period. The Anu ziggurat rising in massive terraces faced with limestone, requiring hundreds of thousands of mud bricks and coordinated labor on a scale that implied either coercion or extraordinary ideological motivation. The Anna precinct, a vast temple complex dedicated to Inanna, featuring buildings with elaborate mosaic decorations, cone mosaics where thousands of painted clay cones were pressed into wet plaster to create geometric patterns that must have shimmered in lamplight like something alive. These weren't experimental structures, first attempts at monumental architecture showing the uncertainties of builders learning as they worked. They were confident, sophisticated, built by people who already knew what they were doing, who possessed architectural knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet according to the gradual development model. The buildings demonstrate understanding of load-bearing structures, of foundation systems that could support massive weight on alluvial soil, of drainage to manage water in a landscape where flooding was a constant threat. Someone knew how to build on this scale, but the preceding centuries show no evidence of the learning curve such knowledge requires. And then there's the pottery. During the late Ubaid period, pottery was beautiful, individually crafted, decorated with painted patterns that showed artistic sensibility and personal expression. Uruk period pottery is different. Mass-produced, standardized, utilitarian. The wheel-made vessels are uniform in size and shape, functional rather than artistic. Produced in quantities that suggest centralized workshops rather than household production. It's not degradation of skill, but deliberate shift in priorities, from aesthetic to efficiency, from individual creation to industrial scale. The change suggests top-down organization, institutional control replacing household autonomy, exactly the kind of economic transformation that temple bureaucracies would later perfect. The question that haunts Mesopotamian archaeology is how this happened so quickly. Population concentration usually brings disease, requiring time to develop immunity, sanitation systems, and social mechanisms for managing illness. Uruk doesn't seem to have experienced this bottleneck. Craft specialization usually means gradual development of trade networks to support non-food producing workers. Uruk's trade networks appear suddenly, extending to Anatolia, Iran, the Persian Gulf, as if the entire infrastructure was implemented simultaneously. Central authority usually emerges through conflict and conquest, leaving evidence of violence, fortifications, weapons evolution. Uruk shows no such evidence, no fortification walls, no weapons caches, just temples getting larger and administrative systems getting more complex. What the texts claim is that the Anunnaki organized this, that divine beings taught humans how to build cities, how to administer resources, how to structure society according to cosmic principles. The mythology insists on intelligent design rather than organic development, on knowledge transferred rather than discovered. And the archaeology, reluctant as scholars are to admit it, shows a pattern more consistent with sudden implementation than gradual evolution, as if someone did indeed activate a switch, bringing complexity that should have taken centuries in a transformation that took decades. The Sumerian King List, compiled around 2000 BCE but referencing much earlier traditions, begins with the statement that sounds like mythology, but is presented as history. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then lists kings who supposedly ruled for impossibly long periods, 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years. Modern scholars dismiss these as mythological, but the text itself makes no distinction between these antediluvian rulers and the historical kings who came later. The reigns only become realistic in length after a great flood, after which the text says, kingship descended from heaven again. What's intriguing is the before. The King List implies a long period when rulership operated under different principles, when time moved differently, when the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki followed patterns that later became impossible. The King List exists in multiple versions, copied and recopied by scribes across centuries, preserved because it was considered important, historical, a genuine record of how human governance began. The most complete versions. The Well-Blundell prism, a clay prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, was inscribed around 2030 BCE during the Isin-Lhasa period. The scribe who created it was copying from older sources, compiling traditions about kingship that reach back to the very beginning of recorded time and beyond, into the mythological past that preceded writing itself. The structure is formulaic. After stating that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, the text lists the city's rulers. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Laljar ruled for 36,000 years. Then kingship moved to Bad Tibira, where more kings ruled for equally impossible durations. Then to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak. 5 cities, 8 kings before the flood, their reigns totaling 241,200 years. Then comes the statement, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish, and suddenly the numbers become semi-plausible. Kings ruling for 1,200 years, 900 years, still impossibly long by biological standards, but approaching the realm where one might imagine exaggeration rather than complete fiction. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Sumerologist who produced the definitive translation of the King List in 1939, noted the text's internal consistency. It treats all rulers identically, using the same grammatical formulas for the antediluvian kings with their multi-millennial reigns as for the early dynastic kings whose historical existence can be archaeologically verified. There's no shift in tone. No indication that the scribe distinguished between mythological and historical figures. Gilgamesh appears in the King List ruling Uruk for 126 years, presented with the same matter-of-fact documentation as Alulim of Eridu with his 28,800-year reign. What could this mean? Orthodox interpretation dismisses the early numbers as purely symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or encoding chronological information in ways we don't understand, or simply inflating figures to emphasize the antiquity and legitimacy of kingship. But the text offers another possibility. That time itself operated differently before the flood, that the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity allowed for lifespans impossible in the post-flood world, that something fundamental changed at the moment of catastrophe. The King List describes the flood not as natural disaster, but as deliberate divine action. Quote, 7. Is presented as an event that reset cosmic order, after which kingship had to descend from heaven again, as if the previous arrangement has terminated. Later texts like the Eridu Genesis and Astrahasis elaborate this moment, describing how the Anunnaki, disturbed by human noise and multiplication, decided to destroy civilization through deluge, with only one god, Enki, breaking ranks to warn a righteous human to build a boat and preserve life. The flood becomes the great divide in Sumerian consciousness, the boundary between the world that was and the world that is. Consider what this implies about pre-flood existence. If the King List is to be believed on its own terms, the antediluvian period was one where human rulers lived for tens of thousands of years, where kingship descended directly from heaven without the ambiguity of later dynasties, where the Anunnaki's presence in human affairs was more direct, more physical, more transformative. The Sumerians themselves seem to have believed they were living in a diminished age, a post-catastrophe world where divine intervention was less frequent, lifespans shorter, where humanity had to manage its own affairs with reduced guidance from beings who had once been more present. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3,300 BCE, are administrative, accounts of grain, beer, livestock. Boring on the surface, but revolutionary in what they imply. These tablets show a society organized around temple complexes, with specialized labor, centralized storage, and redistribution systems. Someone was managing resources on a massive scale, and the temples, dedicated to specific Anunnaki deities, were the organizational centers. But here's what's strange. These accounting tablets appear suddenly, without the centuries of gradual development you'd expect. It's as if the entire system of temple-based bureaucracy was implemented all at once, fully formed, complete with the theological justification that the Anunnaki themselves had ordained this structure. Picture yourself holding one of these tablets small enough to fit in your palm, covered in impressions made by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay before it was baked hard. The markings are pictographic: a circle with a cross meaning sheep, a vertical line with horizontal marks indicating quantities. The tablet records a transaction, beer distributed to workers, with notation of which temple precinct the beer came from, which official authorized the distribution, perhaps even the workers' names or job categories. It's bureaucracy, mundane and necessary, the kind of record-keeping any complex organization requires. But contained in this mundane function is a revolutionary shift in human organization. The tablet proves that someone, some institution, controlled enough surplus resources to support workers who weren't producing their own food. It proves specialized labor existed, people whose full-time occupation was something other than farming. It proves centralized storage, granaries holding grain from multiple sources, redistributed according to administrative decision rather than kinship obligation. It proves record-keeping sufficiently sophisticated that transactions needed documentation for later reference. All of this infrastructure appears in the archaeological records simultaneously at Uruk and other sites in the late 4th millennium BCE. Denise Schmand-Besserat, the French-American archaeologist whose work in the 1970s revolutionized understanding of writing's origins, demonstrated that the pictographic symbols on these earliest tablets derive from three-dimensional tokens used for accounting in earlier periods. Small clay shapes representing sheep, grain, oil had been used as accounting devices for centuries before they were impressed into clay tablets as two-dimensional symbols. Her research showed the logical progression from token to pictograph, explaining how writing could emerge from pre-existing accounting systems. But her work also highlights how suddenly the system became institutionalized. The tokens were simple, used presumably for small-scale transactions between individuals or families. The tablets represent something categorically different: institutional bureaucracy, temple complexes managing resources on behalf of communities numbering in the thousands. The leap from household accounting to state-level administration happened within generations, and that leap required not just technical innovation in recording methods, but social transformation in how communities organize themselves. The temples whose bureaucracies these tablets document were explicitly dedicated to specific Anunnaki deities. The Eanna complex at Uruk belonged to Inanna. Other temple precincts honored An, the sky god. Later tablets name other deities, each with their own institutional structure, their own warehouses, their own workers. The economic system wasn't secular but theological, organized around the premise that the gods owned the land, that humans worked divine property, that priests administered resources on behalf of absent or invisible owners who are nevertheless the legitimate proprietors of everything. This theological justification appears fully formed in the earliest texts capable of expressing it. There's no record of debate about whether the gods should control the economy. No evidence of transition from human to divine ownership, no indication that this arrangement was novel or controversial. The tablets simply assume it, treating temple ownership as obvious, natural, the way things had always been and would always be. Yet archaeologically, this system has no precedent. The Ubaid villages that preceded Uruk show no evidence of temple-based redistribution, no centralized storage, no specialized labor supported by institutional surplus. The transformation happened in the Uruk period, suddenly, completely, leaving no trace of the intermediate steps that such reorganization should require. Among the fragmentary texts recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, one stands out for its cosmological scope. The Eridu Genesis, known from copies dating to around 1600 BCE, but clearly drawing on much older traditions, describes the creation of humanity and the establishment of cities, but more importantly, it describes a progression. First there was nothing, then the gods created humans to work the earth. Then came cities, 5 of them initially, places where humans could flourish. And then came the flood, the dividing line in Sumerian consciousness, after which everything changed. The text explicitly states, there was a time before the Anunnaki had organized the world as the Sumerians knew it, a primitive era that the gods transformed through direct intervention. The Eridu Genesis survives only in fragments, portions of tablets damaged by time, with missing sections that scholars have reconstructed as best they can from parallel accounts in other texts. What remains is tantalizing, a creation myth that begins not with cosmic drama but with absence. The cities had not been built, the land had not been founded. Before creation, there was no organization, no structure, just undifferentiated potential, waiting for divine intention to give it form. Then comes creation, but not of the cosmos itself, which apparently already existed. The creation described is specifically of human civilization. The gods, led by An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, create humans with specific purpose: to serve the gods, to work the land, to build cities where the divine could be properly worshipped. The text describes this without shame or apology. Humans aren't created for their own sake, but as workers, beings whose function is service to the Anunnaki who designed them. After creating humanity, the text says the gods established 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, the same 5 cities listed in the King List as having antediluvian kingship, the places where civilization existed before the flood swept over. These weren't just settlements but special places, cities chosen by the Anunnaki as locations where humanity could develop under divine supervision. Each city had its patron deity, its own temple, its own character within the cosmic plan. Eridu for Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, Bad Tibur for Dumuzi, god of shepherds, and so on, a carefully designed system where divine beings staked territorial claims and assumed responsibility for human development in their respective domains. The text then describes a long period of flourishing. Humanity multiplied, cities grew, civilization developed according to the patterns the Anunnaki had established. But then comes the problem. Humans became too numerous, too noisy, disturbing the gods' peace. The Council of the Anunnaki, meeting in assembly, decided on drastic solution. They would destroy humanity through flood, wipe the earth clean, start over. Most of the gods agreed to this plan, but Enki, who had created humans and perhaps felt more attachment to them than his fellow deities, decided to intervene. Here the text fragments become frustrating. With missing portions that probably described Enki's warning to Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, instructing him to build a boat and save himself, his family and representatives of animal life. The flood comes, lasting 7 days and 7 nights, waters covering everything, destroying the antediluvian world. When it subsides, Ziusudra makes offerings to the gods, who, seeing his survival and piety, decide to grant him eternal life and place him in Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world. What's significant in the Eridu Genesis is its explicit statement that there was a before, a primitive period when humans existed without cities, without organization, without the civilization the texts describe. Then came divine intervention, deliberate creation of structured society, careful establishment of cities in chosen locations. Then came flourishing under divine guidance. Then came catastrophe that ended the first age of civilization, and after catastrophe, a new beginning. Kingship descending from heaven again, the world reorganized under terms different from what had come before. The progression is clear. Pre-civilized humanity, civilized humanity under direct Anunnaki management, catastrophe, and post-catastrophe humanity living in the shadow of what had been lost. Standard archaeological narrative presents Mesopotamian agriculture as a gradual development, centuries of experimentation leading to the intensive irrigation farming that supported Sumerian cities. But the textual tradition tells it differently. Multiple Sumerian myths credit the Anunnaki, particularly Enki, with teaching humans how to farm, how to irrigate, how to domesticate animals and plants. The texts describe these not as discoveries but as gifts, knowledge transferred from beings who already possessed it to humans who did not. What's peculiar is the timing. The intensification of agriculture in southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE happens rapidly, coinciding with the cultural changes that mark the transition from Ubaid to Uruk periods, as if farming techniques suddenly became more sophisticated precisely when the mythology says the gods began directly managing human affairs. Think about what intensive irrigation requires, not just digging ditches but understanding hydrology, soil salinity, seasonal flooding patterns, crop rotation. It requires coordinated labor to construct and maintain canal systems that might extend miles from river to field. It requires dispute resolution when upstream users take too much water and downstream fields suffer. It requires long-term planning, planting decisions made months in advance, storage facilities for surplus to carry communities through lean seasons. Agriculture at the scale that supported Uruk period cities wasn't simple or intuitive. It was sophisticated technology, accumulated knowledge, social organization capable of managing resources across time and space. The archaeological record shows agriculture existed in Mesopotamia for millennia before the Uruk period. The Ubaid peoples farmed, certainly, growing barley and wheat, keeping domesticated animals, producing food surplus beyond immediate consumption. But the scale was different. Individual households or small communities managing their own plots, producing for themselves rather than for export or institutional redistribution. The shift to intensive irrigation agriculture happened relatively quickly in the late 4th millennium, precisely when cities exploded in size and temples became economic powerhouses. Sumerian texts credit Enki with this transformation. Multiple myths describe how Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, organized the agricultural systems that would feed civilization. One text describes how Enki traveled through Sumer, establishing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in their channels, filling them with water, making them overflow at the proper times to fertilize fields. Another describes how he created the plough and taught humans to use it. Others credit him with organizing fishing, establishing the marshes as productive ecosystems, filling them with birds and fish that humans could harvest. The poem, quote, 9-1 of the longest and most detailed Sumerian myths, reads like a divine administrator's report, describing how Enki systematically organized every aspect of Mesopotamian ecology and economy. He assigned the Tigris and Euphrates their roles. He filled the marshes. He established the sea and appointed a deity to manage it. He created rain and gave it to another god to control. He organized animal husbandry, assigning deities to supervise cattle, sheep, and goats. He established weaving and appointed a goddess to teach textile production. On and on, a comprehensive reorganization of the natural world and human economy according to divine plan. What's intriguing is the text's insistence on teaching rather than discovery. Humans didn't figure out irrigation through trial and error. Enki showed them. Humans didn't domesticate animals through generations of selective breeding. The gods created domesticated species and gave them to humanity. Even the plough, that fundamental agricultural tool, was a divine gift rather than human invention. The mythology consistently presents civilization as transferred knowledge, humans receiving instruction from beings who already possessed expertise humans lacked. Can archaeology support or refute this narrative? The honest answer is ambiguous. What archaeology shows is rapid intensification of agriculture, sudden increase in yields, expansion of irrigation networks, all happening in a short period during the late 4th millennium. Whether this represents accumulated knowledge reaching critical mass, allowing exponential growth in food production, or represents knowledge introduced from outside, perhaps by migrants from regions where irrigation was already developed, remains debatable. The mythology offers its own explanation. The gods taught humans, transferring knowledge deliberately, organizing agriculture according to divine plan, because the Anunnaki needed humans to produce surplus that would support temple economies. And that last point matters. The intensive agriculture that appears in the Uruk period wasn't just about feeding people, but about creating surplus the temples controlled. The earliest tablets document this: grain flowing into temple granaries, distributed to specialized workers, supporting priests and administrators and craftspeople who didn't farm, but whose labor built and maintained the institutional structures that defined Sumerian civilization. Agriculture became productive enough to support non-producing specialists exactly when the temples, houses of the Anunnaki, became the economic centers of society. The timing suggests connection, cause and effect, though whether the connection runs from agricultural surplus enabling temples or temples organizing agriculture remains uncertain. In Sumerian theology, the Anunnaki are organized into a council, with An or Anu as the highest authority, followed by Enlil, Enki and other major deities, each with specific responsibilities and domains. This divine bureaucracy mirrors exactly the human administrative structure of Sumerian city-states, with councils of elders, hierarchical priesthoods, and specialized officials. Scholars generally interpret this as humans projecting their social organization onto heaven. But the texts themselves insist on the reverse, that human institutions were deliberately designed to mirror divine patterns, that the Anunnaki established the blueprint for how cities should be governed, and humans simply implemented their design. The question becomes whether the mythology followed the social structure or the social structure followed the mythology, and the texts adamantly claim the latter. The organization is precise, almost bureaucratic in its specificity. At the apex sits An, whose name literally means heaven, the father of the gods, the ultimate authority from whom all divine legitimacy flows. Beneath him, Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm, functions as the active administrator of the divine council, the deity who executes decisions, who makes things happen. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, serves as the chief advisor, the problem solver, the deity who possesses knowledge the other gods need. Below these three come 50 or 60 major deities, the great Anunnaki, each assigned specific domains. Inanna governing love and war, Utu controlling justice and the sun, Nanna presiding over the moon and timekeeping, and on through an elaborate roster of specialized divine officials. This structure precisely parallels Sumerian political organization. Each city-state had its council of elders, respected men who made collective decisions. Below them functioned various officials with specialized responsibilities, administrators managing irrigation, judges resolving disputes, priests conducting rituals, military commanders organizing defense. The hierarchy was clear, authority delegated, everyone knowing their role within the system. When Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki Council meeting to decide humanity's fate, or to resolve divine disputes, they use the same vocabulary employed for human political assemblies, the same protocols, the same decision-making procedures. Orthodox interpretation sees this as obvious anthropomorphization. Humans create gods in their own image, projecting familiar social structures onto the divine realm to make it comprehensible. Of course, the gods have councils and hierarchies and specialized roles. That's how human institutions work, and humans can't imagine alternatives. The mythology is simply a mirror held up to reflect Sumerian society back to itself, given cosmic authority by claiming divine origin. But here's what makes Sumerian theology distinctive. The texts explicitly reject this interpretation. They insist repeatedly that the causal arrow runs the opposite direction. The myth Enki and Ninmah describes how the gods, before creating humans, already had their roles assigned, their domains established, their hierarchy determined. The Eridu Genesis states that when the gods created the first cities, they organized them according to divine patterns that pre-existed human settlement. The instructions of Shurupak, one of Sumer's oldest wisdom texts, advises rulers to govern according to divine precedent, to mirror in their courts the order that exists in heaven. This creates a chicken and egg problem that can't be resolved through evidence alone. Did Sumerian political structures evolve naturally through trial and error, with successful organizational patterns gradually becoming standardized, and was this evolution then projected backward onto mythology as divine mandate? Or did the organizational structures appear suddenly, implemented according to a blueprint the texts claim came from the Anunnaki, with mythology recording actual causal sequence rather than later justification? The archaeology leans towards sudden implementation. The administrative complexity visible in early Uruk period tablets appears without obvious precedent. Fully formed institutional bureaucracy managing resources through hierarchical structures that show no evidence of experimental development. It's as if someone designed the system before implementing it, creating organizational charts and chains of command that were then put into practice all at once. The texts say that's exactly what happened. The Anunnaki designed the structures, and humans built according to divine specifications. Thorkild Jacobson, in his influential work Primitive Democracy in Ancient Mesopotamia, argued that Sumerian political theology reflected genuine historical memory of early democratic assemblies, later overlaid with divine mythology. His research suggested that the earlier Sumerian city-states were governed by councils rather than kings, with assembly-based decision-making that was projected onto the divine realm as the Council of the Anunnaki. But even Jacobson acknowledged the problem. The texts themselves insist the sequence was reversed, that human assemblies were created to mirror divine councils, not the other way around. What cannot be disputed is that Sumerian civilization believed genuinely and completely that their social organization was divinely ordained. Every institution, every office, Every role within the hierarchy existed because the Anunnaki had decreed it should exist. Kings ruled not by personal power but as representatives of divine authority. Priests administered not by human choice but as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The entire structure of society was understood as implementation of cosmic order, and any deviation from established patterns was rebellion not just against human authority, but against the gods themselves. Every Sumerian city was organized around its main temple, the house of its patron deity, one of the Anunnaki who had claimed that particular territory. These weren't merely religious buildings, but economic powerhouses, administrative centers, workshops, granaries, and schools. The temple to Inanna at Uruk, the temple to Enlil at Nippur, the temple to Enki at Eridu, each functioned as the city's central nervous system, the point where divine will translated into human action. Archaeological excavation of these temple complexes reveals they were built and rebuilt on the same sacred spots for millennia, each iteration more elaborate, suggesting these locations had significance long before the Anunnaki mythology reached its mature form. But once that mythology crystallized, the temples became something more than ritual centers. They became the mechanism through which the gods supposedly directed human civilization. Stand in the ruins of the Yana temple complex at Uruk and try to comprehend its scale. At its peak, around 3100 BCE, the complex covered nearly 100,000 square meters, a vast architectural landscape of courtyards, ceremonial halls, storage rooms, workshops, administrative offices, all dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war. The main sanctuary building, with its elaborately decorated facade, sat at the complex's heart, but surrounding it were dozens of support structures handling the practical business of running what was essentially a city within a city. The temple employed hundreds of people, priests performing daily rituals, of course, offering food and drink to the divine statue, maintaining the sacred spaces, conducting festivals according to calendrical precision. But also scribes keeping accounts, craftsmen producing textiles and metalwork, brewers making beer, bakers producing bread, farmers working temple-owned fields, shepherds tending temple flocks, fishermen supplying temple kitchens, laborers maintaining buildings and canals. The temple owned vast tracts of agricultural land, controlled herds numbering in the thousands, stored grain measured in tons, distributed rations to workers who received payment in food rather than currency. This wasn't charity or simple religious devotion. This was sophisticated economic organization, a centralized redistributive system where the temple collected agricultural surplus from lands it controlled and redistributed that surplus to support specialized workers whose labor maintained and expanded the institutional infrastructure. The tablets excavated from temple archives document this system in exhaustive detail. Accounts of grain harvested from specific fields, beer brewed from specific quantities of barley, bread baked for distribution on specific dates, workers receiving specified rations according to their position in the temple hierarchy. What's remarkable is that this system claimed divine ownership of everything. The land wasn't temple property in the sense of being owned by the institution or the priests. The land belonged to the deity. Inanna owned the fields around Uruk. Enlil owned the territory surrounding Nippur. Enki possessed the marshlands near Eridu. Humans, even the king, even the high priest, were merely stewards managing divine property on behalf of absent owners. The tablets sometimes make this explicit. 3,000 measures of barley from the field of Inanna, or 40 sheep from the flock of Enlil, language that treats the deity as the actual proprietor whose possessions were being administered by human servants. The temple building itself functioned as the god's residence. The inner sanctuary housed the cult statue, the physical representation of the deity, which was treated not as symbol but as the god's actual body. Each day, priests would wake the statue with prayers, dress it in fresh garments, offer it meals of bread and beer and meat, entertain it with music, and at night put it to bed with evening prayers. The rituals treated the statue as a living being requiring care and attention, the deity made manifest in physical form that needed to be housed, fed, and honoured. Heinrich Lentzen, the German archaeologist who excavated the Jana complex in the 1950s and 60s, uncovered evidence of this daily ritual practice, offering tables stained with residue from millennia of food offerings, drainage channels where ritual libations were poured, storage rooms still containing the remains of vessels that had held offerings 3,000 years earlier. The mundane evidence of routine religious practice, repeated day after day, year after year, century after century, maintaining the relationship between the city and its divine patron. But the temples were more than residences for gods. They were interfaces, the point where divine and human realms touched, where communication flowed both directions. Through divination and dreams, priests claimed to receive instructions from the deity about how the city should be governed, when to plant crops, whether to wage war, how to handle disputes. Through offerings and prayers, humans communicated their needs and gratitude upward. The temple was the mechanism that made divine government of human affairs practical, providing the institutional structure through which the Anunnaki's will could be known and implemented. The question archaeology cannot answer is whether this system was designed or whether it evolved. Did someone plan the temple economy, creating institutional structures deliberately to achieve specific goals? Or did temples gradually accumulate economic functions, starting as simple shrines and slowly becoming administrative centers through organic development? The texts claim deliberate design, divine blueprint implemented by human builders. The archaeology shows fully formed complexity appearing suddenly in the Uruk period, but whether that suddenness represents design or simply the moment when accumulated changes reached critical mass remains ambiguous. One of the strangest concepts in Sumerian theology is the me, usually translated as quote 19 or quote 20. These were not abstract ideas, but concrete things that could be possessed, stolen, transferred. In the myth, quote 21, the goddess Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals the me from him, taking them from Eridu to Uruk. The text lists over 100 me, including kingship, priesthood, truth, the art of metalworking, writing, music, craftsmanship, even the protocols for conducting warfare and making love. These read less like religious concepts and more like a civilization starter kit, the accumulated knowledge required to build complex society. The mythology presents them as gifts from the Anunnaki to humanity, pre-existing knowledge granted rather than gradually developed. The myth of Inanna stealing the me is one of Sumerian literature's most intriguing texts, presenting theology through what almost reads like divine comedy. Inanna travels from her city, Uruk, to visit Enki in his temple at Eridu. Enki, pleased by her visit, throws a banquet in her honour. They drink beer together, lots of beer, and as Enki becomes progressively drunker, he begins giving Inanna the me, one after another, perhaps boasting, perhaps genuinely generous in his intoxication. Inanna accepts each gift, loading the me onto her boat. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he tries to recover the me, sending various servants and monsters to stop Inanna's boat, but she outmaneuvers them all and successfully brings the me to Uruk. What makes this myth significant isn't the narrative itself, entertaining as it is, but the list of me that Enki gives away. The text enumerates them: lordship, godship, the noble crown, the throne of kingship, the scepter, the staff, the noble sanctuary, shepherdship, kingship, lasting kingship, the divine office of the high priest and priestess, the divine office of the attendants, the divine office of the shrine, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of the smith, the art of the leather worker, the art of the builder, the art of the basket weaver, wisdom, attention, holy purification, the kindling of strife, the quenching of strife, the art of love-making, the kissing of the phallus, prostitution, music, song, art, ritual lament, the shrine, fear, terror, and on and on. Read that list carefully. These aren't abstract metaphysical principles. These are practical skills, social institutions, emotional states, technologies, even sexual practices. The me include both abstract concepts like truth and concrete skills like the art of the smith. They encompass political institutions like kingship and cultural practices like music. They cover religious offices like high priest and economic activities like specific craft specializations. The list reads like an inventory of everything required to build and maintain complex civilization, every skill and institution and protocol that distinguishes urban society from village life. The mythology presents these me as things that exist independently, that can be possessed like physical objects, that originated with the Anunnaki rather than being developed by humans. In the myth, Enki already possesses all the me before giving them to Inanna. They're his to give, pre-existing knowledge that he controls and can transfer. Inanna, by stealing them and bringing them to Uruk, makes her city the center of civilization, the place where all cultural achievements are concentrated. The political message is clear. Uruk's supremacy isn't accident or conquest, but legitimate possession of divine gifts that make civilization possible. But think about what this concept implies about how the Sumerians understood cultural development. They did not believe humans had invented writing, metalworking, music, religious ritual, political institutions, craft specialization, or any other civilizational achievement. All of these existed first with the Anunnaki, and were then transferred to humanity as gifts, as me granted by divine decision. Human creativity wasn't creating but receiving, implementing knowledge that already existed in perfect form, rather than discovering it through experimentation and gradual refinement. Samuel Noah Kramer, translating and analyzing this myth in the mid-20th century, noted its implications for understanding Sumerian self-conception. The Sumerians saw themselves not as inventors of their own civilization, but as recipients of divine instruction. Every achievement, every technology, every institution existed because the Anunnaki had given it, taught it, or permitted it. Human agency was implementation rather than innovation, building according to divine blueprints rather than designing from scratch. This theological stance creates interesting questions about historical reality. Did the me concept develop to explain the cluster of innovations that appeared during the Uruk period, providing mythological justification for rapid civilizational complexity? Or does the concept preserve memory of actual knowledge transfer, perhaps from more advanced neighboring cultures, understood through theological framework as divine gift? The archaeology shows that many of the technologies and institutions listed as me did appear suddenly in Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium, often without clear local precedent. Metalworking, writing, complex political institutions, specialized craft production, all emerged in the Uruk period, and all are listed among the Mi that Enki possessed and Inanna stole. The Mi remain one of Sumerian theology's most enigmatic concepts, concrete enough to be stolen and transferred, but abstract enough to include both physical skills and metaphysical principles. They suggest a civilization that understood itself as constructed rather than evolved, designed according to divine plan rather than developed through human ingenuity alone. Sometimes the most mundane artifacts tell the clearest stories. Ubaid pottery from the pre-literate period is distinctive. Geometric patterns, simple forms, functional but occasionally beautiful. Around 3500 BCE, the pottery tradition changes. Uruk period vessels are mass-produced, standardized, utilitarian. The earlier artistic individuality vanishes, replaced by efficiency and volume. It's a small detail, but it marks a profound shift in how society was organized. From households making their own ceramics to centralized production, from art to commodity, from individual expression to institutional control. The transition happens precisely when the Anunnaki enter the written record, when temples become economic centers, when mythology starts insisting that divine order requires human obedience to establish patterns. Hold a piece of Ubaid pottery in your mind, one of those vessels from 4500 BCE, before writing, before cities, before the Anunnaki had names written in clay. The pot is wheel-made, the clay smoothed carefully, the surface decorated with flowing black painted lines on a buff background. The patterns are geometric but organic, suggesting water or plants or abstract forms that might mean something or might simply please the eye. Each vessel is unique, made by an individual potter working in their household or small workshop, creating functional containers that are also artistic expressions. The decoration required time and skill beyond what mere function demanded, suggesting these potters took pride in their work, that making beautiful things mattered even when simple containers would have served the practical purpose. Now compare that to Uruk period pottery from 3200 BCE. The vessels are still wheel-made, the clay competently worked, but the decoration has vanished. These are utilitarian objects, standardized in size and shape, produced in large quantities, designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. The individuality is gone. Every jar looks like every other jar of the same type. The production has clearly shifted from household craft to centralized workshops, producing inventory and volume, optimizing for quantity over quality, treating pottery as commodity rather than craft. Joan Oates, the British archaeologist who spent decades studying Mesopotamian pottery sequences, documented this transition in exhaustive detail. Her excavations at Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia and analysis of materials from southern sites revealed how pottery styles shifted during the 4th millennium BCE. The change wasn't gradual, she noted, but relatively sudden, a transformation happening over just a few generations. The artistic traditions that had characterized ceramic production for over 1,000 years simply stopped, replaced by industrial standardization that prioritized function over form. What caused this shift? The practical answer is economic organization. The Uruk period temples needed pottery in volume, storage jars for grain, serving vessels for rations, transport containers for trade goods. Individual households producing their own decorated pottery couldn't meet institutional demand. Centralized production, specialized potters working full-time in temple workshops could. The shift from artistic to utilitarian pottery reflects the broader shift from household-based to institution-based economy, from families producing for themselves to specialists producing for redistribution. But there's a cultural dimension too. The loss of decorative tradition represents the loss of individual expression in favour of institutional conformity. The potters making Uruk period vessels weren't expressing personal creativity, but fulfilling production quotas. Their skill lay in efficiency and volume rather than artistic innovation. The change suggests a society where individual autonomy was being subordinated to institutional demands, where conformity to established patterns mattered more than personal expression. This transition happens precisely when the textual tradition says the Anunnaki organized human society according to divine blueprint. The mythology insists that proper order requires humans to follow established patterns, to implement divine design rather than experiment with their own ideas. The pottery reflects this ideology materially. The loss of individual variation in favour of standardized production, the replacement of artistic expression with efficient functionality, the subordination of personal creativity to institutional requirements. It's as if the society was being reorganized according to principles that valued order, hierarchy, and conformity over the organic variety that had characterized earlier periods. The archaeologist might see this as natural consequence of urbanization and institutional development. The theologian might see it as evidence that mythology influenced material culture, that religious ideology shaped economic production. The cynic might see it as loss of freedom. Individuals being subordinated to institutional control. But whatever the interpretation, the pottery tells a story. Something fundamental changed in how Mesopotamian society was organized during the Uruk period, and that change is visible in objects as mundane as cooking pots and storage jars. Every Mesopotamian tradition, from Sumerian through Babylonian to Assyrian, contains a flood narrative. Not just any flood, but the flood, the dividing line in cosmic history. In the Sumerian version, found in texts like the Eridu Genesis and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki decide to destroy humanity with a deluge. But one god, Enki, warns a righteous man to build a boat. What's significant is not the flood story itself, which has parallels worldwide, but how Sumerian texts use it as a chronological marker. There is pre-flood history, the antediluvian period when everything was different, and post-flood history, when the current world order was established. Archaeological evidence does show a significant flooding event in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. Layers of water-laid silt in excavations at Uruk, and other sites. Whether this was the flood of mythology, or whether an actual disaster was mythologized into something cosmic is debatable, but the Sumerians clearly organized their historical consciousness around it. The flood appears in every major Mesopotamian text dealing with origins and history. The King List divides time at the flood. Before it, kings ruling for impossible durations. After it, kings with more realistic reigns. The Eridu Genesis describes creation, flourishing, flood, then recreation. The Atrahasis epic, the most detailed Mesopotamian flood narrative, presents the deluge as the climax of a long story about divine-human relations. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, though primarily about the hero's quest for immortality, includes a lengthy flood narrative told by the survivor Utnapishtim. The consistency across texts suggests the flood wasn't peripheral mythology, but central to how Mesopotamians understood their past. In the Sumerian version, the cause is human noise. Humanity has multiplied, cities have grown crowded, and the noise disturbs the gods' rest. The Divine Council, led by Enlil, decides on drastic solution. wipe the earth clean with deluge, start over with quieter, more manageable human population. Most of the Anunnaki agree to this plan. They will unleash the waters of heaven and earth, drowning everything, eliminating the problem through annihilation. But Enki, who created humans and feels attachment to them, decides to intervene without directly defying the council's decision. Enki cannot openly warn a human without violating the assembly's decree, so he employs clever indirection. He goes to the reed house of Ziusudra, a righteous king of Shuruppak, and speaks to the wall of the house rather than to the man himself. Quote, 27. Ziusudra, hearing this, understands the warning and begins construction. The boat, according to later Babylonian versions, is enormous, a cube measuring 120 cubits on each side, plastered with bitumen inside and out to make it waterproof, divided into compartments, equipped to hold Ziusudra's family and representatives of all animal species. The construction takes considerable time, and the text describes Ziusudra explaining to his neighbours that he's building because he's fallen out of favour with Enlil and must leave the city. Whether they believe this excuse or mock him as mad, the text doesn't say, but eventually the boat is finished, loaded and sealed. Then comes the storm, 7 days and 7 nights of rain, accompanied by wind, darkness and terror. The text describes the waters rising, covering the mountains, drowning everything. Even the Anunnaki, having unleashed forces beyond their control, flee to heaven in fear, crouching like dogs against the outer wall, terrified by the destruction they've caused. Inanna weeps, lamenting that she supported the decision to destroy humanity. The gods regret their choice, but cannot stop the flood once unleashed. When the waters finally subside, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Ziusudra sends out birds to test whether land has emerged. First a dove, which returns finding no perch, then a swallow, which also returns, finally a raven, which doesn't return, indicating dry land exists. Ziusudra disembarks and immediately makes offerings to the gods, burning sacrifices whose smoke rises to heaven. The starving gods, having had no offerings for 7 days, gather around the sacrifice like flies, grateful for the first worship they've received since the deluge began. But Enlil, arriving and seeing the boat, becomes furious that humans survived. His plan was total destruction, yet here stands Ziusudra with his family and animals, having escaped the judgment. Enki then reveals his intervention, arguing that complete destruction was excessive, that punishing humanity with disease or famine or wild animals would have been more proportionate than total annihilation. The other gods agree, having regretted their decision anyway. Enlil, outvoted and seeing the wisdom of preserving humanity, grants Ziusudra and his wife immortality and places them in Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world, where they will live forever as the only humans to escape death. This is the story, told and retold across millennia, preserved in multiple versions, clearly central to Mesopotamian self-understanding. But did anything like it actually happen? Leonard Woolley believed it did. His discovery of flood strata at Ur, that 11-foot layer of clean clay separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding, suggested to him that a genuine deluge had occurred, catastrophic enough to bury entire settlements beneath sterile silt. He calculated that such a flood would have covered an area approximately 300 miles long by 100 miles wide, essentially all of southern Mesopotamia as the Sumerians knew it. To people living in that region, such a flood would have seemed universal, the entire world drowning, exactly as the texts describe. Modern archaeology is more cautious. Flood deposits appear at various Mesopotamian sites, but not all at the same time, suggesting multiple local floods rather than one universal deluge. The clay layer at Ur dates to around 3900 BCE, but similar deposits at Uruk date to around 2900 BCE, and at Shurupak to approximately 2800 BCE. These were clearly separate events, regular features of living in a flood-prone river valley, not evidence of the single apocalyptic deluge mythology describes. But perhaps that's precisely the point. Perhaps the mythology preserves memory not of one catastrophic flood, but of flooding as constant threat, the danger that characterized life in Mesopotamia, the disaster that could destroy cities and harvests and lives with terrifying regularity. The mythological flood becomes symbolic, the ultimate expression of a danger that was all too real, elevated to cosmic significance as the moment when the world ended and began again. The Sumerians lived with water as both blessing and curse, rivers that brought life and floods that brought death, and perhaps the flood narrative captures this ambivalence, this awareness that the forces sustaining civilization could also destroy it, that humanity existed at the mercy of powers beyond human control. Whether those powers were called gods or simply the unpredictable violence of nature itself. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur, dug through occupation layers dating back millennia. At a depth of approximately 40 feet, his workers hit a stratum of clean clay, 11 feet thick with no artifacts, no pottery, nothing. Below that clay layer, they found more occupation debris, older settlements. Woolley believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical and Sumerian flood, a genuine deluge that had buried the earlier civilization beneath sterile silt. Modern archaeology is more skeptical, noting that such flood deposits are common in Mesopotamia and don't appear simultaneously at all sites, suggesting local rather than universal events. But what Woolley's discovery confirmed was that the Sumerians' memory of life before a catastrophic flood wasn't entirely mythological. Something had happened, something significant enough to become the organizing principle of how they understood their past. Picture the moment of discovery. Woolley's workers, local men from the villages near ancient Ur, digging down through layers of broken pottery, collapsed walls, the accumulated debris of human occupation. Each layer represents a different period, different people living their lives, discarding their trash, rebuilding their homes. The workers recognize the patterns, know what to expect. More pottery, more walls, more evidence of habitation as they descend through time. Then suddenly the artifacts stop. Clean clay, water-laid sediment, sterile and uniform, extends downward foot after foot. 11 feet of nothing, just clay deposited by water and left undisturbed. Woolley's first thought must have been confusion. Had they reached bedrock? Had human occupation simply not extended this deep? But the clay felt wrong, too uniform, too clean, clearly deposited by water, rather than being the natural geological substrate. He ordered the workers to keep digging, breaking through the clay stratum, wondering what lay beneath. And then, below the 11 feet of sterile silt, artifacts appeared again. Pottery, walls, occupation debris. Evidence of human settlement that had been buried, sealed beneath the flood layer, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed it. For Woolley, the interpretation was immediate and certain. This was the flood, capital F, the biblical deluge, the Sumerian catastrophe described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Physical proof that mythology preserved memory of actual disaster. He calculated the flood's extent based on the silt layer's thickness and distribution. To deposit 11 feet of uniform clay required massive water volume, he reasoned. A flood covering essentially all of southern Mesopotamia, drowning cities, killing populations, burying civilization beneath sediment. To people living in that region, such a flood would have seemed universal, the entire known world submerged. Exactly as the texts describe, his announcement made international news. Quote 28 declared the headlines. Here was archaeological evidence supporting biblical and ancient Near Eastern texts. Proof that the stories weren't merely mythology, but preserved memory of genuine catastrophe. The discovery seemed to validate the historical core of flood narratives, suggesting that beneath theological interpretation lay actual disaster, remembered and mythologized, but rooted in real experience. But archaeology since Woolley has complicated this interpretation. Max Mallowan, who worked with Woolley at Ur and later excavated other Mesopotamian sites, found flood deposits at different sites dating to different periods. The stratum at Ur dated to approximately 3900 BCE. Similar deposits at Uruk dated to around 2900 BCE. Shrupak's flood layer was approximately 2800 BCE. These weren't the same event but different floods separated by centuries, each catastrophic for the communities affected but clearly local rather than universal. Susan Pollock, analysing Mesopotamian settlement patterns, noted that flooding was a constant feature of life in southern Iraq, not exceptional disaster, but regular threat. The rivers flooded every year during spring snowmelt from the mountains. Most floods were beneficial, depositing nutrient-rich silt that fertilized fields, but occasionally conditions aligned to produce catastrophic flooding, rivers breaking their banks, water covering fields and settlements, destroying crops and homes and lives. The archaeological record preserves evidence of such events repeatedly across millennia, so perhaps Woolley found not the flood but a flood, one of many that periodically devastated Mesopotamian communities. Yet his discovery remains significant because it confirms what the texts claimed, that the Sumerians' historical consciousness organized around memory of catastrophic flooding wasn't pure invention. They lived with flooding as existential threat, and somewhere in their past floods had been severe enough to destroy settlements, bury cities, create the division between before and after that the mythology preserved. What matters is not whether a single universal flood occurred, but that Mesopotamians experienced flooding as apocalyptic disaster and organized their historical understanding around it. The mythology elevated repeated disaster into cosmic event, singular catastrophe marking time's division, but the underlying experience was real. Water as both life-giver and destroyer, civilization built in a landscape where nature could erase human achievement without warning, survival dependent on forces beyond human control. Several Sumerian texts hint at a time before the Anunnaki structured human existence, a primitive period described ambiguously, sometimes as paradisiacal, sometimes as chaotic. The quote 29 begins by stating that in the early days, humanity knew neither grain nor sheep, surviving on grass like animals. Then the Anunnaki created sheep and grain and gave them to humans. The quote 30 describes how Enlil created the seasons to organize agricultural time. These texts present a pattern. Humans existed, but in an unformed state, until the Anunnaki imposed structure, agriculture, animal husbandry, seasonal awareness. Whether this represents folk memory of the pre-agricultural period or mythological explanation for civilization's emergence is ambiguous, but the texts are consistent in describing a before when humans lacked the knowledge and organization that later defined Sumerian culture. The debate between sheep and grain opens with cosmological scene setting. Long ago, when heaven had been separated from earth, when the gods had established the cosmic order, humanity already existed. But these early humans were primitive, the text says, grazing on grass like sheep, drinking water from ditches, not knowing how to grow grain or weave cloth or build houses. They were human in form but animal in behaviour, lacking the knowledge that distinguishes civilized people from beasts. Seeing this primitive state, the gods held council, and Enlil decided that humanity needed help, needed the gifts that would allow civilized life. So they created sheep and grain, not as animals and plants but as divine beings, personifications of pastoral and agricultural abundance. These deities were born in the Duku, the holy mound, the cosmic location where creation occurred. The gods fed and nurtured sheep and grain, then sent them down to earth to benefit humanity. But the text is ambiguous about humanity's pre-agricultural state. Was it paradise? Humans ate grass and drank water freely like animals in the garden. They had no labour, no worry, no complexity. Or was it misery? Humans lived like beasts without culture, without the achievements that make human life meaningful. The text doesn't judge clearly, presenting the primitive state as simply different, a time before the Anunnaki organized human existence according to civilized patterns. After sheep and grain descend to earth, everything changes. Humans learn to herd sheep, to shear wool, to weave textiles. They learn to plant grain, to harvest, to bake bread. They learn to build permanent houses, to establish settlements, to organize labor. The transformation is presented as sudden, knowledge granted rather than discovered, humanity elevated from animal-like existence to civilized society through divine gift rather than human innovation. The debate between winter and summer follows similar pattern. Before Enlil created the seasons, the text implies time was undifferentiated, no clear agricultural calendar, no organized relationship between planting and harvest. Enlil, seeing the need for temporal structure, created winter and summer, personified as divine beings who argue about which is more important for human welfare. Winter claims superiority because it brings rain and rest. Summer insists it's more valuable because it brings growth and harvest. The debate is eventually resolved by Enlil, who declares both necessary, establishing the cycle that organizes agricultural time. What these texts preserve is memory of transformation, a time when human existence operated under different principles before the Anunnaki imposed the structure the Sumerians knew. Whether this represents actual memory of the Neolithic revolution, when hunter-gatherers became farmers, or merely mythological explanation for civilizational features that required divine origin, cannot be determined. But the consistency is striking. Across multiple texts, Sumerian theology insists there was a primitive period, a before time when humans lacked agriculture, animal husbandry, seasonal awareness, all the knowledge that civilization required. The archaeological record does show such a transition, of course. Southern Mesopotamia's earliest inhabitants were hunter-gatherers. Then came the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE, then intensive farming around 4,000 BCE. The text could be preserving distant folk memory of these transformations, filtered through millennia, explained through theological framework that attributed change to divine intervention rather than human innovation. Or the text could be mythological explanations constructed to account for civilizational features whose human origins had been forgotten, creating divine causation to explain what seemed inexplicable otherwise. What cannot be denied is that Sumerian culture understood itself as deliberately constructed, created according to divine plan rather than evolved through human effort. Every aspect of civilized life, from agriculture to seasonal calendars, existed because the Anunnaki had designed it, taught it, implemented it. The before time, whether paradisiacal or chaotic, was the period when humans existed without this divine organization, when life operated according to different, simpler, less structured principles. Among the Anunnaki, Enki holds a special position as the deity who supposedly organized civilization's practical aspects. Texts describe how he established the Tigris and Euphrates rivers' courses, taught irrigation techniques, created the plough, filled the marshes with fish and birds, and assigned each Anunnaki deity their particular domain. The long poem Enki and the World Order reads like an ancient instruction manual, describing how every aspect of Mesopotamian life was systematically designed and implemented by divine intelligence. What makes this mythology significant is not whether it's literally true, but what it reveals about how Sumerians understood their own society. They did not believe their civilization had evolved naturally, but that it had been deliberately constructed according to a divine blueprint. Every institution and technology, a gift from beings who possessed knowledge humans could not have developed independently. Quote, 35 is one of Sumerian literature's longest and most detailed mythological texts. Preserved in multiple copies suggesting it was important, frequently copied, central to Sumerian self-understanding. The poem runs over 400 lines, a sustained narrative describing how Enki systematically organized Mesopotamian civilization, establishing each element of the natural and cultural landscape according to divine plan. The poem begins with Enki's credentials. He is the son of An, the lord of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, possessor of wisdom, the god who knows everything, who understands the me, those cosmic principles we discussed earlier, who has authority to organize creation according to divine intention. Having established his legitimacy, Enki begins his work, traveling through Sumer, establishing each element that makes civilization possible. First, he addresses the rivers. Enki stands at the Tigris and Euphrates, speaking to them as if they're living beings, which in Sumerian theology they were, divine entities that required instruction about their proper behavior. He tells the rivers to fill with abundant water, to bring life-giving floods at proper times, to overflow their banks enough to fertilize fields, but not so much as to destroy settlements. He places the river god in charge, assigning specific divine oversight to ensure the rivers function correctly. Then he moves to the sea, the Persian Gulf at Mesopotamia's southern edge. Enki establishes the sea's boundaries, fills it with fish, assigns a deity to manage maritime resources. He creates the marshlands where fresh water meets salt water, filling them with reeds and birds and fish, establishing them as productive ecosystems humans can harvest. Each environment receives divine attention, careful organization, assignment of oversight to ensure it functions according to intended design. Next, Enki addresses agriculture. He creates rain, places it under specific divine control. He establishes the plough, teaches the proper techniques for breaking ground and planting seed. He organizes the agricultural calendar, determining when planting and harvest should occur, establishing the seasonal cycles that govern farming. He creates the field gods, deities responsible for ensuring crops grow properly, and instructs them in their duties. The poem then moves through various civilizational technologies and institutions. Enki establishes building construction, creating the techniques for making mud brick and constructing houses. He organizes animal husbandry, assigning deities to oversee cattle, sheep, and goats. He creates weaving, placing the goddess Utu in charge of textile production. He establishes pottery, metalworking, carpentry, each craft receiving divine origin and divine oversight. He doesn't neglect social institutions. Enki establishes kingship, determining how rulers should govern. He creates the priesthood, defining their roles and responsibilities. He organizes law and justice, establishing principles for resolving disputes. He even addresses marriage and family, determining proper relationships between humans. What's remarkable is the comprehensiveness. Nothing is left to chance or human innovation. Every aspect of Mesopotamian life, from river courses to craft techniques to social institutions, receives divine design and implementation. The poem presents Enki as cosmic administrator, systematically establishing each element required for civilization to function, missing nothing, leaving no aspect of human existence unorganized. Samuel Noah Kramer, translating this text in the mid-20th century, noted its implications. The Sumerians didn't believe they had created their own civilization through gradual development and innovation. They believed every element had been deliberately designed by divine intelligence, then implemented according to that design. Human role was not innovation, but obedience, following the patterns Enki established, maintaining the systems he created, living within the structure he defined. This theological stance explains Sumerian conservatism, their resistance to innovation, their tendency to maintain traditional practices even when alternatives might have been more efficient. Innovation wasn't valued because proper patterns already existed, established by divine authority. Human wisdom was recognizing and following those patterns, not attempting to improve them through human creativity. The Barton cylinder, a clay cylinder dating to approximately 2200 BCE, but recording much older traditions, describes the creation of Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, home to Enlil's main temple. But before describing Nippur's glory, it describes what existed before. No city had been built, no settlement had been founded, Nippur had not been created, Eka, Enlil's temple, had not been built. The text then describes how the Anunnaki established the city, made it their meeting place, and from there, organized the governance of all other Sumerian cities. Archaeological work at Nippur shows occupation going back to the Ubaid period, approximately 5000 BCE, but the site's importance as a religious center dates to the early dynastic period, around 3000 BCE, exactly when writing becomes sophisticated enough to record the mythology that justified Nippur's supremacy. The Barton cylinder, named after the American scholar George Barton who published its translation in 1918, is a foundation cylinder, a clay object inscribed with text and then buried in the foundations of a building, meant to preserve for eternity the circumstances of the building's construction. This particular cylinder was discovered at Nippur itself, appropriate given that its text describes Nippur's creation and divine significance. The text begins with primordial void, when An, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag created the black-headed people, meaning humanity, the Sumerians' term for themselves. Quote 38. The text emphasizes absence, cataloguing what didn't exist before divine action. No cities, no temples, no canals, no organized civilization. Just undifferentiated landscape and scattered humans living without structure. Then the gods decided to create Nippur. An and Enlil, the two highest deities, chose the location, determined it would be the religious center of all Sumer, the place where the divine council would meet to make decisions affecting all of Mesopotamia. They founded the city, established the Eka mountain house, Enlil's temple, and from this central location organized the governance of every other Sumerian city. The text describes Nippur's special status. Unlike other cities, which each had their own patron deity, Nippur belonged to all the gods collectively. It was neutral ground, the location where the Anunnaki Council convened, where disputes between deities were resolved, where decisions affecting multiple cities were made. No single god dominated Nippur because it was meant to be impartial, belonging to the divine assembly rather than any individual deity. This theology had practical political implications. Nippur never became a major political power, never had kings who dominated other cities militarily, never built an empire. But it remained religiously supreme throughout Sumerian history. Whoever controlled Nippur gained religious legitimacy, divine sanction for their political authority. Kings from other cities would travel to Nippur to receive blessing from Enlil's priests, recognition that transformed them from local rulers into legitimate kings with cosmic authority. Archaeological excavation of Nippur, conducted primarily by the University of Pennsylvania, beginning in 1889 and continuing intermittently through the 20th century, revealed occupation extending back to the Ubaid period, approximately 5000 BCE. But the earliest levels show nothing special, just ordinary settlements like those found at other Ubaid sites. The distinctive religious architecture, the massive temple complexes that made Nippur recognizably different from other cities, date to much later, the early dynastic period around 3000 BCE. This creates the same pattern we've seen elsewhere. The site has deep history, occupation extending back millennia before it acquired religious significance. Then, relatively suddenly, the site's character transforms. Massive religious construction begins. The site becomes qualitatively different, architecturally and functionally, from what it had been. And this transformation coincides with writing becoming sophisticated enough to record the mythology justifying the transformation, texts explaining that Nippur had always been special, chosen by the gods before any city existed, destined from creation to be the religious centre. Did the mythology follow the architectural transformation created to justify Nippur's religious supremacy after it emerged? Or did the mythology precede and motivate the transformation, religious beliefs determining that Nippur should be religiously central, then physical construction implementing that theological decision? The Barton cylinder insists on the latter, that Nippur's specialness existed from the moment of creation, that divine decision preceded human implementation. But the archaeology shows ordinary village becoming special religious centre around 3000 BCE, suggesting the mythology developed to explain and justify what had already occurred through more mundane political and religious processes. When archaeologists excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 50s, they found something extraordinary beneath the ruins of Enki's temple. 17 earlier temples, one built atop the ruins of the previous, stretching back to approximately 5200 BCE, into the Ubaid period before writing, before complex theology, before the Anunnaki had names that could be written down. The earliest temples were simple, single-room shrines with altars and offering tables. With each rebuilding, the structure became larger, more elaborate, more confident in its architectural expression of divine presence. By the time we have texts describing Enki's temple, the Iabzu, quote 40, the building had evolved through thousands of years of continuous ritual activity. The theology had caught up with the architecture, or perhaps the architecture had always been reaching toward the theology it would eventually house. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, The Iraqi and British archaeologists who excavated Eridu between 1946 and 1949 faced a peculiar challenge. The site showed obvious signs of being important, massive temple ruins visible on the surface, but initial excavation revealed these were relatively recent, dating only to the early dynastic period around 2800 BCE. Beneath them, however, were more ruins, older temples built on the same spot, and beneath those, still older temples. Safar and Lloyd realized they were looking at continuous occupation of sacred space extending back through millennia. They designated the temples by number, Temple 1 being the earliest, Temple 17 being the latest substantial structure before the site's abandonment. Temple 1, at the bottom of the sequence, dated to approximately 5200 BCE, deep into the Ubaid period, centuries before any mythology we can read, predating writing itself by 1500 years. It was simple, a single rectangular room measuring 12 feet by 15 feet, walls of mud brick less than 2 feet thick, a small altar or offering table at one end, plastered floor showing signs of repeated ritual activity. Temple 2, built after Temple 1 collapsed or was deliberately dismantled, was slightly larger, 18 feet by 20 feet, walls somewhat thicker, suggesting either increased confidence in construction techniques or increased resources available for construction. Temple 3 was larger still, and so on through the sequence. By Temple 7, around 4500 BCE, the structure measured 30 feet by 45 feet, with multiple rooms, a larger altar, more elaborate architectural details including decorative niches in the walls. The progression continued through centuries. Temple X, dating to approximately 4000 BCE, showed sophisticated architectural understanding, buttressed walls supporting the weight of the structure, carefully plastered interior surfaces, evidence of regular ritual maintenance. By Temple 15, around 3300 BCE, during the Uruk period, the temple was monumental, sitting on a raised platform, visible from distance, architecturally dominating the settlement. Temple 17, the final substantial structure, dating to approximately 2800 BCE, was massive, a complex of interconnected rooms and courtyards built on a high platform, walls decorated with elaborate patterns, drains for ritual purifications, storage facilities for offerings. This was recognizably the Iabzu described in texts, Enki's house, the temple where the god of wisdom resided in architectural splendor. What's extraordinary is the continuity. 17 building phases over 2,400 years, each choosing to rebuild on exactly the same spot, maintaining the same orientation, preserving the sacred space despite changes in construction techniques, architectural styles, even possibly population groups. Why this location? What made this particular ground sacred enough that for 2.5 millennia, people returned to it after each collapse or destruction, choosing to rebuild the temple precisely where it had stood before? The site sits near where springs emerge from the ground, fresh water welling up in an otherwise arid landscape. This natural phenomenon would later be mythologized as the Abzu, the cosmic underground freshwater ocean that Enki controlled. Perhaps those springs were always considered sacred, the mysterious emergence of life-giving water from earth suggesting divine presence. Perhaps the earliest shrine was built to honor the springs, and subsequent rebuilding maintained that ancient association. Or perhaps the sacredness was created through accumulated ritual, each generation adding their devotion to what previous generations had established, the ground becoming holy through continuous worship rather than any inherent quality. the architecture reaching upward through time, each temple larger and more elaborate than its predecessor, suggesting growing confidence in divine presence, growing resources dedicated to honouring that presence, growing theological sophistication about who the deity was and what worship required. By the time texts describe the Eabzu, the theology was elaborate. Enki, god of wisdom, controller of fresh water, possessor of the me, residing in his temple at Eridu, the first city, the place where civilization began. But beneath that elaborate theology lay 5,200 years of simpler devotion, unnamed gods or spirits honoured in modest shrines by people whose beliefs we can only infer from the buildings they left behind. The architecture came first, the theology followed, or perhaps both emerged together across millennia, each informing the other, the buildings expressing and the texts explaining a relationship between humans and divine that neither architecture nor language alone could fully capture. Here is what troubles scholars who study Mesopotamian religion: the gap between archaeological evidence and textual tradition. The earliest temples date to 5200 BCE. Writing appears around 3300 BCE. But when writing does appear and becomes sophisticated enough to record religious texts, around 2600 BCE, the Sumerian Pantheon is already fully formed, elaborately detailed, with complex relationships between deities, established mythologies, and detailed ritual protocols. 800 years passed between the first writing and the first religious texts, centuries during which the theology we recognize as Sumerian must have developed. But we have no record of that development, no gradual evolution from simple animism to elaborate pantheon. The Anunnaki appear in texts as if they had always existed exactly as described, a complete mythological system with no visible prototype. Think about what this gap means. From approximately 3300 BCE, we have administrative tablets, accounting records, bureaucratic documentation, simple pictographs recording grain and beer and livestock, practical information about temple economy. The symbols are crude, the writing system limited, capable of recording things and quantities but not yet sophisticated enough to express language, narrative, theology. This proto-writing continues for centuries, gradually becoming more abstract, more capable of representing sounds rather than just objects, evolving toward true writing that can capture speech. By approximately 2800 BCE, the writing system has matured. Cuneiform proper, symbols pressed into clay with reed stylus, capable of representing the Sumerian language phonetically, able to express not just what and how many but who, why, when, where. The technology for recording mythology now exists. But when the first religious texts appear around 2600 BCE, they don't show preliminary theology, simple beliefs being refined into complexity. They show fully developed mythology, elaborate pantheon, complex relationships between deities who already have detailed personalities, domains, mythological histories. The quote 41:1 of the oldest surviving religious texts, dating to approximately 2600 BCE, addresses the temple of Ninhursag at Kesh with sophisticated theological language. It describes the temple's divine foundation, its cosmic significance, its relationship to other temples and deities. The text assumes the reader already knows who Ninhursag is, what her domains are, how she relates to other Anunnaki. There's no explanation, no introduction, just direct engagement with established theology that must have been common knowledge. Similarly, early versions of myths like quote 42 show elaborate narrative, complex divine personalities, established mythological geography. Inanna already has her character fully developed, proud and ambitious goddess of love and war. The underworld already has its rules, its 7 gates, its divine inhabitants. The cosmic structure is already complete, detailed, functioning according to established principles that the text references without explaining because the audience already knows them. Where did this theology come from? The 800 years between writing's invention and the first religious texts must have been when the Sumerian Pantheon crystallized from whatever simpler beliefs preceded it. Priests must have debated, refined, systematized religious ideas during these centuries, creating the elaborate theology that eventually was written down. But we have no record of this process, no intermediate stages, no texts showing theology in development. It's possible, perhaps likely, that religious texts were being written during those 800 years but haven't survived. Clay tablets are durable but not indestructible. Texts recording mythology might have existed but were lost, destroyed by flood or fire, or simply disintegrating over millennia. The administrative tablets survived because they were baked hard, deliberately preserved for archival purposes, often buried in temple foundations. Religious texts, if written on unbaked clay or other perishable materials, might have simply dissolved back into mud. Or perhaps religious knowledge was deliberately kept oral during this period. Priests memorizing and transmitting mythology through spoken tradition, only later deciding to commit sacred knowledge to written form. Many religious traditions maintain oral transmission as more authentic than written text, believing that sacred knowledge requires personal teaching rather than documented instruction. Perhaps Sumerian priests operated similarly, and what we see in the earliest written texts is capture of long-established oral traditions that had been refined over centuries without being written down. But neither explanation fully satisfies the mystery. The completeness, the consistency, the elaborate detail of the earliest written mythology suggests not oral tradition gradually recorded, but systematic theology deliberately documented. The texts show no variation, no competing versions, no signs of different theological schools or regional differences that oral tradition typically produces. The Anunnaki appear already organized, already assigned domains, already embedded in mythological narratives that function as if everyone already knows the stories being referenced. This gap remains one of Mesopotamian scholarship's persistent puzzles. The theology must have developed somehow, somewhere, during those centuries we can't see. But how it developed, who developed it, what earlier, simpler forms it evolved from, remain invisible, hidden in the period between writing's invention and theology's documentation. The Anunnaki emerge into written history fully formed, as if they had always existed exactly as described, waiting only for humans to invent writing sophisticated enough to record their names and deeds. Babylonian tradition, inheriting Sumerian beliefs, preserved accounts of the Apkallu, 7 sages who lived before the flood and brought civilization's arts to humanity. These beings were described as fish-like or having fish attributes, servants of Enki, who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and temple building. The first Apkallu Adapa was said to be partially divine, created by Enki himself. Later Mesopotamian texts treat these Apkallu as historical figures, listing them by name alongside the antediluvian kings, presenting them not as myths, but as actual beings who had existed in that strange pre-flood period when time moved differently, and humans lived alongside entities who possessed knowledge beyond mortal capacity to develop independently. Whether these represent garbled memories of actual teachers, perhaps from more advanced neighbouring civilizations, or pure mythology constructed to explain cultural achievements, remains one of Mesopotamian archaeology's persistent mysteries. The Apkallu tradition is preserved primarily in Babylonian texts from the first millennium BCE, but these texts claim to be recording much older Sumerian beliefs. Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 300 BCE, provided the most detailed account in his history of Babylonia. He described how in the earliest times a being named Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf, appearing to the people living along the coast. Oannes had the body of a fish, but underneath was a man with human feet and human hands, capable of speech and reasoning. According to Berosus, Oannes spent days teaching humanity the fundamentals of civilization. He taught writing, instructing people how to form the cuneiform symbols that would allow them to record knowledge. He taught mathematics, explaining number systems and calculation methods necessary for commerce and astronomy. He taught agriculture, showing proper techniques for irrigation and cultivation. He explained law, establishing principles for justice and social organization. He taught architecture, demonstrating how to construct houses and temples according to proper patterns. When evening came, Oannes would return to the sea, spending nights beneath the water, emerging again each morning to continue instruction. After Oannes came 6 more Apkallu, each appearing during the reign of one of the antediluvian kings, each teaching additional aspects of civilization, each contributing to humanity's development under divine guidance. The Sumerian text, quote 43, correlates these Apkallu with specific pre-flood rulers. Yuan, or Adapa, appeared during Alulim's reign at Eridu. Yuan-Duga appeared during Alalja's reign. Enmeduga during Amelu-Ana's reign. And so on through 7 sages, the last appearing shortly before the flood. The Apkallu were not quite divine, but not quite human either. Texts describe them as created by Enki specifically to teach humanity, given knowledge the gods possessed but humans lacked, sent to Earth as civilizing mission. Their fish attributes suggest connection to water, to Enki's domain as god of fresh water and wisdom, to the Persian Gulf from which they emerged. Some scholars interpret this literally, suggesting the Apkallu tradition preserves memory of actual teachers arriving by sea from another region, perhaps the Indus Valley Civilization or Arabian Peninsula, bringing advanced knowledge to pre-literate Mesopotamia. The tradition is specific about what they taught, not just general concepts but particular technologies, cuneiform writing, not writing in abstract but the specific script used in Mesopotamia. Mathematical systems based on 60. The sexagesimal notation that characterized Mesopotamian mathematics, agricultural techniques specific to irrigation, farming in alluvial plains, architectural methods using mud, brick and reed, appropriate to southern Mesopotamia's environment. If this were pure mythology, why such specific detail about technologies and techniques that were indeed distinctive to Mesopotamian civilization? Later Mesopotamian tradition maintained the Apkallu as cultural heroes, beings whose memory was honored, whose wisdom was invoked. Protective figures carved with fish attributes were placed in building foundations, called Apkallu figures, meant to bring the sages' protection to the structure. Rituals invoked the 7 Apkallu, calling on their ancient wisdom to bless contemporary undertakings. They weren't forgotten mythology but living tradition, continuously referenced across millennia. Modern scholarship struggles with the Apkallu tradition. If interpreted literally, they suggest contact with an outside civilization, bringing advanced knowledge to Mesopotamia, but archaeological evidence shows no sudden introduction of foreign technology or architecture that would support this interpretation. If interpreted mythologically, they're simply cultural heroes created to explain civilizational achievements, but the specificity and consistency of the tradition across texts suggests something more than arbitrary invention. Perhaps the Apkallu represent both memory and mythology, preserving in distorted form actual knowledge transfer that occurred during Mesopotamia's formative periods. Perhaps traders, travellers, or migrants from more developed regions did bring new technologies and techniques, and over generations these teachers were mythologized into semi-divine sages with fish attributes. Perhaps the fish symbolism relates not to literal appearance, but to their arrival from across water, from the Persian Gulf's far shore, transformed through retelling into beings who were themselves partially aquatic. Or perhaps the Apkallu tradition is purely mythological explanation for something that troubled the Mesopotamians themselves. How had their civilization begun? How had their ancestors learned writing, mathematics, architecture? Law? Human innovation and gradual development wasn't a satisfying answer, so they created the Apkallu, divine teachers who brought complete knowledge, explaining civilizational complexity through intervention rather than evolution. But even this interpretation doesn't explain why fish imagery specifically, why 7 sages particularly, why connection to pre-flood period especially, why such detailed correlation with the King List's antediluvian rulers. The Apkallu remain mysterious, tradition that seems to point toward historical memory, but remains stubbornly resistant to straightforward interpretation, beings who hover at the boundary between history and mythology, refusing to be reduced to either category completely. Modern understanding of Sumerian civilization owes an immeasurable debt to Samuel Noah Kramer, the Ukrainian-American scholar who spent 50 years translating Sumerian texts in the mid-20th century. Before Kramer's work, Sumerian literature was largely inaccessible, fragmentary clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide. Kramer assembled these fragments like an impossible jigsaw puzzle, matching pieces separated by continents, reconstructing poems and myths that hadn't been read as complete works for 4,000 years. His translations revealed how central the Anunnaki were to Sumerian consciousness, how every aspect of civilization was explained through their intervention, how pre-Anunnaki existence was remembered as fundamentally different from the organized world the texts describe. Kramer remained skeptical of interpretations that treated the Anunnaki as anything other than mythology, but his translations provided the raw material for every theory that followed. Kramer's story begins in Ukraine in 1904, a Jewish family in Vilno, later moving to Philadelphia, where young Samuel became fascinated by ancient languages. He studied Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, eventually specializing in Sumerian at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the few institutions in America where ancient Near Eastern languages were taught. By the 1930s, he was working with the university's vast collection of cuneiform tablets. Tens of thousands of clay fragments excavated from Mesopotamian sites, but largely unstudied, sitting in storage waiting for scholars with the linguistic expertise to read them. The challenge was extraordinary. Sumerian had been a dead language for 2,000 years even in ancient times, replaced by Akkadian as Mesopotamia's spoken language, but preserved by scribes for religious and literary purposes. Decipherment had begun in the 19th century, but by Kramer's era, most Sumerian texts remained untranslated, too fragmentary or damaged for scholars to reconstruct complete meaning. Individual words might be readable, but full narratives, complete poems, coherent myths remained inaccessible. Kramer developed a method that revolutionized Sumerian studies. He realized that many texts had been copied multiple times by ancient scribes, creating duplicate tablets now scattered across different museum collections worldwide. By comparing fragments from Philadelphia's collection with pieces held in Paris, London, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, he could sometimes reconstruct complete texts from tablets that individually were too damaged to read. It was painstaking work, requiring photographic memory, linguistic brilliance, and infinite patience. But gradually, Kramer assembled Sumerian literature into readable form. His publications transformed understanding of Sumerian culture. Quote, 44 in 1944, quote 45 in 1956, quote 46 in 1963, and dozens of academic articles presenting newly translated texts. For the first time, scholars and general readers could access Sumerian myths, hymns, prayers, and wisdom literature in complete readable form. The Anunnaki emerged from these translations as central to every aspect of Sumerian thought. Not peripheral religious figures, but the organizing principle explaining how civilization existed. Kramer's translations revealed patterns previous scholarship had missed. He showed how consistently Sumerian texts attributed civilizational achievements to divine instruction rather than human innovation. He documented the before and after structure of Sumerian historical consciousness, the primitive period preceding the Anunnaki's organization of human society. He traced theological concepts across multiple texts, demonstrating how consistently different myths presented the same cosmological framework, the same divine personalities, the same explanation for why human civilization operated according to particular patterns. But Kramer was a traditional philologist, trained in linguistic analysis and textual reconstruction, deeply skeptical of speculative interpretations. When his translations were used to support theories about ancient astronauts, advanced prehistorical civilizations, or literal interpretation of Sumerian mythology, he objected strenuously. The Anunnaki were gods, he insisted. Mythological beings created by human imagination to explain natural phenomena and social institutions. To read them as anything else was to misunderstand how ancient mythology functioned. Yet Kramer's own translations presented puzzles he acknowledged but couldn't fully explain. The sophistication and consistency of Sumerian theology, appearing fully formed in the earliest texts, the detailed descriptions of pre-civilized existence, and the transformation that brought complexity. The pattern where every civilizational achievement was attributed to divine teaching rather than human development. Kramer documented these patterns without claiming to fully explain them, presenting the text as faithfully as possible and allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. His legacy is the accessibility of Sumerian literature. Before Kramer, only specialists could engage with these texts. After Kramer, anyone interested in ancient Mesopotamia could read translations of myths, prayers, and poems that revealed how the Sumerians understood themselves and their world. Whether those texts should be read as pure mythology or as preserving distorted memory of historical events remained debatable, but at least now the texts themselves were available for analysis, no longer locked in fragmentary clay tablets awaiting scholarly attention. No discussion of the Anunnaki can avoid addressing Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial author who, beginning in the 1970s, proposed that Sumerian texts should be read literally, that the Anunnaki were not gods but extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity as a slave species to mine gold. Mainstream academia rejects Sitchin's translations as fundamentally flawed, his linguistic methodology as non-existent, his conclusions as unsupported by actual textual evidence. But his book sold millions of copies and permanently altered how popular culture understands the Anunnaki. shifting them from deities in an ancient pantheon to aliens in ancient astronaut mythology. What matters for our purposes is not whether Sitchin was right, which scholars universally agree he was not, but that Sumerian texts do describe a before and after, a transition from primitive human existence to civilization complex enough to seem divinely gifted, and that this transition remains insufficiently explained by conventional archaeological narrative alone. Sitchin's, quote 47, published in 1976, proposed a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian mythology, where scholars read, quote 40, Sitchin read, quote 49, where scholars saw creation myth, Sitchin saw genetic engineering, where scholars interpreted divine intervention as mythological explanation for natural phenomena, Sitchin argued for literal extraterrestrial contact. The Anunnaki, he claimed, came from a planet called Nibiru on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around the Sun, arriving on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their planet's atmosphere. Finding manual labor exhausting, Sitchin argued, the Anunnaki genetically engineered primitive hominids into modern humans, creating a worker species to mine gold on their behalf. This explained in his interpretation the sudden appearance of Homo sapiens, human civilization's rapid development in Mesopotamia, and the Sumerian text's consistent attribution of civilizational knowledge to divine teaching. The Anunnaki weren't gods but advanced aliens, and what Sumerian mythology described as divine intervention was actually extraterrestrial colonization and genetic manipulation. Academic response to Sitchin was uniformly negative. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages, wrote extensive critiques demonstrating that Sitchin's translations were not merely unconventional, but fundamentally wrong, based on misunderstanding of Sumerian grammar, mistranslation of key terms, and selective quotation ignoring context. Irving Finkel, curator of cuneiform collections at the British Museum, dismissed Sitchin's work as, quote, 50 quote, having no relationship to actual Sumerian texts. Countless other scholars, including those who had spent careers studying Sumerian language and literature, rejected Sitchin's theories as lacking any legitimate textual or archaeological support. The problem wasn't just that Sitchin's conclusions were unconventional, but that his methodology was flawed. He wasn't a trained Sumerologist, had never studied under scholars who actually read cuneiform, based his translations on previously published scholarly works, which he then reinterpreted according to his theories. When scholars examined his linguistic work, they found mistranslations, misunderstandings of grammar, and interpretations that no legitimate reading of the Sumerian could support. He wasn't reading the text carefully and reaching surprising conclusions. He was starting with conclusions and forcing the text to support them. But despite unanimous scholarly rejection, Sitchin's books became international bestsellers. Quote, 50 Fomwand, sold millions of copies, translated into dozens of languages, spawning sequels and imitators, creating an entire genre of ancient astronaut literature. The ideas entered popular culture, influencing television shows, documentaries, and endless internet speculation. The Anunnaki became, for millions of readers, not mythological deities but historical aliens, and Sitchin's interpretation, despite being academically discredited, became more widely known than legitimate Sumerian scholarship. Why did Sitchin's theories resonate so powerfully? Perhaps because they provided simple, dramatic explanation for mysteries that conventional scholarship acknowledged but couldn't fully explain. How did writing appear suddenly? Aliens taught it. How did intensive agriculture develop rapidly? Aliens implemented it. How did complex social organization emerge quickly? Aliens designed it. The ancient astronaut hypothesis offered concrete, comprehensible answers, where archaeological narrative provided only gradualism, cultural diffusion, and accumulation of knowledge over time. What matters for our understanding is not whether Sitchin was right, but what his popularity reveals about the genuine puzzles in Mesopotamian civilization's origins. The Sumerian texts do describe sudden civilizational complexity. They do attribute knowledge to divine teaching. They do present a before and after structure where human existence fundamentally transformed. Conventional archaeology explains this through natural processes, accumulated innovation, cultural development. Sitchin offered alternative explanation, one scholars reject but which captured popular imagination precisely because the conventional narrative, while probably correct, leaves certain aspects of Mesopotamian civilization's rapid emergence not fully explained. The lesson is that mysteries remain. How exactly did Sumerian civilization develop so quickly? Where did the theological sophistication come from? Why do the texts so consistently insist on divine teaching rather than human innovation? Sitchin's answers were wrong, but the questions that made those answers appealing remain legitimate subjects for archaeological and historical investigation. Step back from Sumer and examine the broader pattern. Egyptian tradition credits the god Thoth with teaching writing, mathematics, and astronomy. Greek mythology has Prometheus stealing fire and knowledge from the gods to give to humans. Mesoamerican cultures describe Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan teaching agriculture, architecture, and calendrical systems. Chinese tradition preserves accounts of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, mythical rulers who taught civilization's fundamentals. Hindu texts describe the rishis, divine sages who transmitted the Vedas. Across unconnected cultures, the origin story of civilization follows the same template. Humans existed in a primitive state until beings with superior knowledge taught them everything required for complex society. The Sumerian version with the Anunnaki is simply the oldest written version of a global mythological pattern, preserved in cultures that believed civilization was not slowly developed through human ingenuity alone, but transmitted, taught, gifted by entities who already possessed what humans needed to learn. The consistency is remarkable. Egyptian texts describe Thoth emerging at the beginning of time, establishing writing with hieroglyphs, teaching mathematics that allowed pyramid construction, organizing astronomical knowledge that governed their calendar. Thoth wasn't abstract deity but specific civilizing figure whose intervention transformed primitive Egyptians into civilization builders. The mythology treats this not as gradual cultural development, but as sudden knowledge transfer, divine being teaching humans what they couldn't discover independently. Greek tradition, despite being more sophisticated and skeptical than earlier mythologies, preserved the Prometheus story. Humans lived in primitive darkness until Prometheus stole fire from Olympus, giving not just flame but technology, craft knowledge, cultural achievements that distinguished humans from animals. Zeus punished Prometheus for this theft, but humans retained the knowledge, using it to build civilization. The pattern is identical. Humans primitive until divine intervention brings knowledge, transforming human existence fundamentally. Mesoamerican mythology from cultures that had no contact with Old World civilizations describes Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who taught agriculture, showing humans how to cultivate maize, establish city according to proper patterns, taught astronomy and developed calendrical systems, then departed with promise to return. The Maya and Aztec didn't believe they had developed their own civilization. but the Quetzalcoatl had taught them, bringing complete knowledge that they implemented according to his instruction. Alternative traditions describe Kukulkan or Viracocha serving identical civilizing roles in other Mesoamerican and South American cultures, bearded figures arriving from elsewhere, teaching fundamental technologies, establishing social organization, then departing. Chinese mythology preserves the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine rulers of the prehistoric period who taught civilization's fundamentals. Fuxi taught fishing and hunting, established marriage customs, created the trigrams underlying Qing divination. Shen Nong taught agriculture, showing proper techniques for cultivation, tasting herbs to determine which were medicinal. Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, taught warfare, mathematics, and bureaucratic administration. These weren't gods exactly, but beings who existed in that ambiguous space between divine and human, possessing knowledge humans lacked, teaching what needed to be known before Chinese civilization could properly begin. Hindu tradition describes the rishis, 7 sages who possessed complete knowledge, transmitted the Vedas to humanity, established ritual practices and social organization. These weren't mythological figures but teachers, beings who understood cosmic order and instructed humans in how to align earthly existence with divine patterns. The Vedas themselves claim to be revealed knowledge, transmitted rather than composed, received by sages who could perceive divine wisdom and express it in language humans could understand. The pattern appears worldwide, in cultures that had no contact with each other, developing independently on separate continents. Humans primitive until beings with superior knowledge teach civilization's fundamentals. Writing, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, social organization, religious ritual, all described as taught rather than developed, transmitted rather than discovered. These specifics vary: Anunnaki in Mesopotamia, Thoth in Egypt, Prometheus in Greece, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, but the structure is identical. Why this pattern? One possibility is that it reflects universal human psychology, the tendency to attribute important achievements to external sources, to explain complexity through divine origin, rather than acknowledging slow human development. Creating gods or culture heroes who taught civilization provides satisfying narrative, clear causation, specific beings to honor and thank for human prosperity. It's more emotionally resonant than the mundane reality that civilization emerged through countless small innovations by forgotten individuals over millennia. But another possibility is that the pattern preserves distorted memory of actual knowledge transfer. Perhaps advanced groups did teach less developed populations, traders or migrants bringing agricultural techniques, architectural methods, astronomical knowledge from regions where these had already been developed. Over generations, the human teachers became mythologized into gods or semi-divine beings, their knowledge attributed to supernatural rather than merely advanced human sources. The core memory of being taught rather than developing independently persists, even as the teachers themselves are transformed into beings beyond human. Or perhaps both interpretations contain truth. The mythological pattern emerges from psychological need to explain civilization's origins through external causation, but the pattern gained power precisely because it aligned with actual historical experiences of knowledge transfer, making the mythology feel true because it resonated with dim folk memory of times when strangers arrived, teaching new ways of doing things, transforming how communities lived. What remains clear is that the Sumerian texts, the oldest written version of this global pattern, describe with remarkable consistency a transformation they attribute to the Anunnaki. Whether this should be read as pure mythology, as distorted memory of actual cultural contact, or as something else entirely remains debatable. But the pattern itself appearing across unconnected human cultures suggests something fundamental about how humanity understands its own civilizational origins. A story we keep telling ourselves because at some level, perhaps, we remember being taught, and so the story drifts into darkness, the way all ancient voices eventually do, carried on wind that has blown across these same Mesopotamian plains for 50 centuries, touching ruins that once were cities, brushing past mounds that once were temples, whispering through reeds descended from the reeds those first builders harvested to construct their shrines to gods whose names they were only beginning to learn how to write. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. Clay pressed by hands that have been dust for millennia, baked hard by fires that went cold when Rome was young, carrying memories of a time before memory had permanent form. The Anunnaki, whether gods or metaphors or something we don't yet have language to describe, remain present in those pressed marks, waiting with the patience that only the truly ancient possess, offering their story to anyone willing to listen across the gap of time that separates their world from ours. Perhaps what matters most is not whether the Anunnaki were literal or symbolic, whether civilization was taught or developed, whether the texts preserve history or construct mythology. Perhaps what matters is that the Sumerians looked at their own complexity, their cities and writing and agriculture and law, and felt the need to explain it through something greater than themselves. They sensed, as perhaps we should sense, that what makes us human, what allows us to build and create and preserve knowledge across generations, is itself mysterious, worthy of wonder, deserving of stories that reach beyond mundane causation into the realm where meaning lives. You're connected to them now, to those ancient scribes pressing warnings and wisdom and wonder into wet clay by lamplight. The same questions they asked still echo. The same mysteries they contemplated still hover in the dark. The same stars they tracked with such intensity still wheel overhead, patient and distant and utterly indifferent to whether we understand the patterns they trace. Let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same sky they charted, part of the same human story of wondering, questioning, trying to understand where we came from and what invisible hands might have shaped us. Rest now. The ancient world will still be here, patient as clay, mysterious as cuneiform, waiting to share its secrets when you wake.